morning and welcome to Sunday School for May 15th. My name is Brandon Keaton and I'm the Director of Music Ministries here at First Methodist of Albany. And today we're going to be continuing in our series, The Steps You Take. This one today is called An Awesome Wonder. It has more to do with the wonders of creation and how we associate with it. We're going to be looking at Job chapter 38. We're going to look at the first 11 verses of that chapter. You know, it's interesting that last week we were talking about tithing and how that tithing is a part of the holiness code in Deuteronomy, that God is calling us to, or is calling his people to separate themselves from Canaanite worship practices and from the way that other people eat, setting up kosher laws. And then how do we deal with our giving, and how do we deal with the things that we have been given, the things that we give, and how do we distribute those, how do we celebrate those with God. And that all of that comes together as these are means of holiness, of being set apart to God, because we are in relationship with him. It's interesting that most of the time when we think about the book of Job, that would not be the first thing that we would think of, because we always talk about Job as being somebody who has all this suffering that he goes through, even though he is good. And so the question always comes up, well, why do good people suffer, or why do bad things happen to good people? Well, Job doesn't really answer that question. I hate to tell you that, but because if we're going to try to frame the book of Job as an answer to suffering and divine justice, then by the time we get to chapter 38, where the Lord is going to speak in his own defense before Job and his friends, then we're going to be left with a sad state of no answer. Okay, because that's not what he does. God basically challenges Job to stand up and try to answer a whole bunch of questions that, of course, Job has no way to answer. But if we look at the book of Job as being about a relationship with God, which is exactly what the prologue says. Remember when in the prologue of Job, when Satan comes to tempt God, or to test God, or to allow a testing for Job, what does God say? Have you considered my servant Job, that no one else is like him? Okay, this is an indicative of a relationship with God, that he knows Job knows him. And so if we will frame it like that, if we will say that the book of Job is about a relationship of God, then God's speeches, which begin here in chapter 38, do provide an answer. It's very, very important to frame it this way. So, Job eventually will respond to God. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that obscures my plans without words, without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind doors, when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it, and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come, and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt." Sometimes my reading is interesting. Sometimes I'm just making it up. Well, so, eventually, well, what do we see here? First of all, we see that God is, again, he is asking a lot of really tough questions to Job, and these all have to do with the created world. How does he deal with created world? Eventually Job is going to answer the Lord in chapter 40 and in chapter 42. And first, in chapter 40, Job confesses his unworthiness and inability to answer God's challenge. Why is that? He's a man. He's human. He's not God. He doesn't know. And then the second time in chapter 42, Job confesses that he has spoken out of insufficient knowledge of God. And his experience that we read throughout the entirety of the book in the dialogues of Job, compared with his later experience, which he has actually heard the voice of God, hearing, and he is seeing God at work. We see that there is a difference between hearing what he thought he knew about God and then seeing what he actually knows about God now. And so this would even suggest that there has been progress made in that relationship. No longer is he just hearing, but he's also seeing. His repentance, when he finally does repent, it's not about sin because he hadn't sinned, but it's because he didn't have sufficient knowledge of God. That's why it's interesting when the Lord poses that challenge in verse 2, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? So, yet while humanness manifests itself in all of the craziness of the dialogues that we have heard, it's interesting that Job never curses God. Satan claimed he would. His wife even suggested that he should do it. And so what we see is that he has passed that test of faith. But in God's speeches, Job is exposed to the overwhelming power and glory of the creator and sustainer of the universe. And so Job, in all of his questioning and his demand for answers from God, and his caricature of God, come under scrutiny of God himself. And now God is going to make demands of Job. So since God prevented Job from being destroyed, he had this first thing. This is the first thing that God has allowed there to be all of these tests and all these trials before Job, but he has not been destroyed. But God presents Job to Satan's scrutiny and to his evil pleasure, and then the question then is, why would he do this? Why would he do that? Okay. But then the next question is going to be, well, why should God object when Job, in all of his dialogues, presents God himself to the reader's scrutiny and pleasure? In a sense, Job turns the tables on God, yet God affirms Job again in the epilogue, finally at the very end, giving balance to the book. So the book is about Job's relationship with God. It is the book about God and humanity. So in this very first speech that begins in chapter 38 and ends at the beginning of chapter 40, we have a series of questions and challenges that God places before Job. What happens is that the Lord draws circles, tightening circles around Job. First, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Okay, we've heard that in verse 4. And this is followed by a series of other questions that challenge Job's knowledge of the created world. Then later, in verse 12, we have the question, have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? And then other questions that go with it that challenge Job's personal involvement with the created order. And then finally, in this first speech, at the very end of chapter 38, we see the question, do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions after they couch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? This and other questions after it challenge Job's ability to manage and control the animal kingdom. So all of these are about his control over things that he has absolutely no control over. So, there back in verse 1, we see that God speaks first, and he says, I am the Lord. Of course, this is the covenant name of Israel's God, Yahweh. And only the prologue and the epilogue, which is what we're in right now, ever use that name. In comparison, all of the rest of the dialogue, so the bulk of the book of Job, never uses that word. They use generic names for God like Elohim or El or Eloah or Shaddai. They use those names, and it's interesting. It's possible too that this is not an accident, that the theological design in this is that the author did not want to use the covenant name for God, Yahweh, in a context of words that put God in a negative light. So that's why he only uses generic words. So for the first time since the prologue, we have Yahweh being speaking and calling himself by name. So he's answering Job, and then he says, it's out of the storm. What's interesting is that most of the time we would view this storm cloud as a theophany. This is an appearance of God. But what's interesting is that this is really a voice of God. He is seeing something, seeing this thing going on, this storm going on, but he's not really quite seeing God, and it's interesting to me that God is turning the tables on Job. He asks him to answer all of these questions. He asks, where were you? The implication is that, Job didn't even exist when God created the world, so how could he even understand any little bit of it? God uses the metaphor of building a house to describe the work of creation. This is a very different look at creation than Genesis chapter 1 and 2 had in it. And remember, too, he says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Laying the foundation or the capstone of a building was a special occasion, a joyful celebration. And so these are not rhetorical questions. God is expecting that Job will answer him. That's interesting too, that do we ever think that when we question God that he might have questions for us? Oftentimes when I have questioned him, that's exactly what has happened. It's exactly what has happened to me, is that he brings back some of those questions, and then I realize, oh yeah, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. It has become one of my themes in this life that a little humility goes a long way. And I have found that is true in most situations. That if we can stop and listen, if we can start to think about things from another person's perspective, then a lot of the trouble that we have in our world might be diminished just a little bit. Whether that's social, political, ecological, whatever. It's important for us to have humility when we are dealing not only with each other, but with all of creation. This passage really deals so much with the created world. And we are called to be sustainers of that world, to be stewards of that world, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that this is the world that he has given to us, that he created for us. The world that he said, behold, it is very good. And though there are troubles and trying times in this world, there are things that are not as they should be because we are living in a sinful world. It is still a beautiful world that He has given to us. And the humility that we show toward each other and towards His creation and towards our Creator are significant for us. You know, this idea that Job is giving us, or that the writer of Job, he's asking us questions that we can't possibly understand or know the answers to, but we know one who does. And so when we hear all of the voices of craziness going on in the world, everything trying to lead us down a crazy path or a path to ruin and destruction, what we can say without doubt is that even though I hear all those, I am still listening for the still small voice of God. That I can trust in the one who holds everything together. I love the line that says, I may not know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. So whenever we are in the midst of troubling times, what we can do is rest in the joy and the knowledge that we are being held together in the palm of God's hand, and that He holds the world together, and that He cares about us, He loves us, and He wants to be in relationship with us. Thanks be to God for His indescribable gift. Amen.